Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr Gott, dich, loben, which translates to Lord God, we praise you. This is the German Te Deum from the Mass. All in all, actually, can I say this is a straightforward chorale? In most cases, yes, but this chorale has some modal influence, some mode mixture as well. Lots of twists and turns and some ambiguity as well that goes into the overall perception of really what's going on. I don't think there are some sections where I don't think it's very clear regarding what key we're in, or even if we're in a key rather than being in a mode. I have my take on this particular chorale. That's what I'm going to be presenting in this video, but there's definitely gray area and nuance, and explaining all of that is what's going to make this video longer than probably any other video I've ever recorded. This chorale is a whopping 4 pages long, and yeah, the long form took me all of my allotted time yesterday to analyze, which means I didn't have time to record anything yesterday, which broke my daily upload pattern that I've been maintaining since I had pneumonia a couple months ago. But all in all, the chorale is largely straightforward. I'd say maybe like 60 to 75% straightforward, but there's a large deal of ambiguity from the very beginning and consistent throughout the end that we'll get into as we go through it. So starting off, we start with E minor, and all the way at the end here, we end on E major. So from the looks of it, it looks like the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor, but really I don't know what the overall tonality of this chorale is. It is a lot of different keys at the same time, and I would say the overall tonality of this chorale is probably G major based on just the representation, but we look at a lot of keys at like the 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock position on the circle of fifths, so maybe by the end of the video we'll have a better idea. But the chorale, I think, starts with a mode very similar to older chant-based forms where the lead cantor will sing the beginning of the melody and then the rest of the chorus will follow. I think we're starting off with an incipit that outlines the melody. I didn't look into the original chant that the melody is based on, but yeah, the beginning here, I think we're in some type of A minor based system here, maybe even like A Aeolian. And you might be asking, what's the difference between A Aeolian and A minor? After all, A minor and A Aeolian, if you're looking at just the diatonic pitch collections that are like, you know, the no chromaticism, no leading tone, they're the same pitch collection, so what's the difference? Well, saying A minor implies tonality, and I don't think that this first progression right here is very tonal. We're looking at it through a tonal lens because it's part of a larger tonal work, but the introductory chord progression doesn't really follow a normative chord progression that we would expect to see in a piece by Bach, that we expect to have narrative structure. So we start off with a minor 5 chord. That's also a difference really between minor and Aeolian, is the absence of the leading tone. And this first cadence is some type of plagal cadence. We start off with E minor, and then we go to E minor again, E, B, E, and G, before we go to D, D, F, and A, which is our 4 chord. So already an unusual progression that we're not used to seeing. We then go to C major, C, G, F, and C, but this F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, so this is a 3 chord. We then go from 3 back to 4, D, G, D, and A, another 4-3 suspension, this time in the tenor, and then we cadence on A minor, A, E, C, and A, which is our tonic triad. So very unusual introductory progression. That's why I feel like this is more modal than anything else, because even though the pitches are outlining A minor, we have no leading tone. This is not a progression that's governed by tonic dominant relationships. We have a bunch of chords that are diatonic to like natural minor, or Aeolian, which I think is a more accurate way of describing it. We're going to turn right back around to something far more tonal. The second phrase in the beginning ends with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G, and I do believe that we start off with in the key of G major. This A minor chord here, A, C, E, and C, is our tonic in the key of A, and it's also our 2 chord in the key of G. Passing tones in the inner voices give us a D7 chord over A, D, F sharp, and C, which is important, largely because 2 going to 5 is a normative progression, but in this case it's a passing chord and is going to be recontextualized as sort of like a turnaround to get back to G on beat 2 of the next measure. So we get E, E, G, and C here, which is 4, 6. 5 to 4, 6, it's a bit of a deceptive progression, kind of a substitute for 6. Passing tone in the bass, anticipation here in the tenor, and a suspension starting in the alto. This gives us D7 over F sharp this time, which is 5, 6, 5. And then we get G, D, A, and B, this A and 9/8 suspension over the bass, but our tonic nonetheless. We then get C, E, G, and A. That's A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach likes 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential situations. D is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, F sharp is a non-chord tone, E is a chord tone, and then we are getting ready for our 5 chord D, C, F sharp, and A. More specifically 5, 7, that's a D7 chord. D and C are both chord tones, and then we end with G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Fairly straightforward here. Starting off with the second section, it's going to get out of hand if we start using letters for things because of the form of the piece, so I'm just going to call them the sections sequentially. Second section starts off with a phrase that ends in a half cadence in the key of G. We start off with E, G, G, and C. It's a 4, 6 chord, C major over E, A, E, G, and C. I think all in all, I think we have a double suspension going on here. The E and the G are both sort of pointing down towards this F sharp and this D here that are really more so pointing towards the next measure. So I feel like this might be like a 5, 4, 3 chord that eventually sort of goes down to a root position 5 chord. So this D and this F sharp are both chord tones. This E is a non-chord tone, and then we get D, D, F sharp, and C, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position, but there's no 5th in the chord. It does get introduced on the and of the beat, but not super important. Passing tone in the bass, F sharp's a chord tone, G is part of the next beat, G, D, A, and B. A is another 9/8 suspension that we saw, just like we saw in the previous phrase. G is our resolution, F sharp's a passing 7th. Then we get G, C, E, and A, which is 2, 4, 2, A minor 7 over G. We would expect this to resolve to some type of 5, 6 chord, which it does, F sharp, D, D, and A. So the 4, 2 chord resolving like we would expect, even in a very strange chorale. D is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, D is also a non-chord tone. And just to preface the rest of the video, I'm going to be rushing through a lot of the chords, not because I am lazy or anything. This was a pretty large undertaking to analyze, just because I want to get through the video, and I was debating whether or not I wanted to spell chords at all, but really I'm just going to try and spell them as accurately as I can and get through the Roman numerals so that I can have more time to talk about the parts that deserve or need more attention than just basic functional harmony like we expect to see. 5, 6 goes to G, B, D, and B, which is our tonic triad, G major. E is a non-chord tone, E is a non-chord tone, D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and G is a chord tone. We kind of get this idea of E minor happening here very briefly with the bass, and then we have A, C sharp, G, and A. I guess maybe there's a little bit of an argument that we do move to the key of D major right here at the end. I think this is a half cadence, though. It just sounds like A wants to resolve down to G. But all in all, yeah, it's not super important, I guess. We're tonicizing D, so that's obviously going to impart some D major emphasis, but I still think we're in the key of G. We get A, C sharp, G, and A. Another one of those sort of incomplete 5-7 chords. But this is a 5-7 of 5 more specifically because A is our dominant in the key of D, and D is our dominant. E is a neighbor tone. G is, oh no, apologies, E is a chord tone. F sharp, we have a little sort of deceptive suspension here where it's like a 7-6, or like a 7-6 suspension, but the 7th is part of the chord, which is kind of interesting. And then we resolve to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. Another cool thing is that Bach sort of takes this focus of D right here and uses this A major chord to pivot us to what I'm calling the key of C major. It's kind of an interesting progression because we're going to end in the key of G major with a perfect authentic cadence, but this A major chord here is sort of like 5-6 of 5 again, like C sharp, E, E, and A with this 7th right here, but this is eventually going to be resolved down to F. So I feel like, actually, how do I want to analyze this? Yeah, I guess, how is this going to happen? This is kind of a tough one. I think by this point we are in the key of C major, and this is now our 2 chord. I'll just go ahead and analyze it as a direct modulation just because of the pivot, and I would say maybe there are a couple of different ways you can go about doing this. One is saying that this secondary dominant is our common chord between G major and C major, but there's nothing really inherently C major-like about the A major chord. I feel like we're not in the key of C major until we hear that F natural. So I'm just going to analyze this as a direct modulation. This is a more complicated modulation. I know I've analyzed these differently based on circumstance in the past, but yeah, I'm going to say this is just C right here, just because it's happening over like a pivot chord that isn't common between the 2 keys. But afterwards we get E, D, F, and G. This D is a non-chord tone. This F is like a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and I think really what's happening here is we're getting kind of a 3 chord in root position, like an E minor chord, or maybe a C major chord in first inversion. I know 2-to-1 is kind of interesting. We don't see that progression all that often, unless it's in a wacky situation like this where there's counterpoint and interesting rhythmic configurations that sort of put a 1 chord in the texture. But I think that we have some adjacent harmony going on here. And even though we never really have a fully contextualized E minor chord, I think that that's sort of what's being alluded to because of the harmony that's being built up to, which is like 2, 3, 4, F, A, C, and A. So some adjacent harmony. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get D, F, D, and B, which is B diminished over D. It's a 7-6 chord in the key of C major. Passing tone here in the alto, F's a chord tone, and then we get C major, C, G, E, and C, which is our tonic triad. It also happens to be 4 in the key of G. We know that we're moving towards G because of this F sharp here. And then we have C, E, G, and C again. Those are all chord tones, no need to reanalyze. Then we get D, D, G, and A. G is a 4/3 suspension. We know this is some type of 5 chord. Little delayed passing 7th here before we get G major, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, moving to our next phrase. It's short. It's just a single phrase that gets repeated twice. Ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. I think we stay in the key of G for the first 2 beats. We have C, G, C, and E, which is our 4 chord. And then we get B, G, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in first inversion 1/6. A is a non-chord tone, B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get A minor, A, C, E, and A, 2 chord, which also happens to be our 1 chord in the key of A minor. F is a non-chord tone, A is a chord tone, D is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone. We then I guess we kind of have a bit of like a D minor idea going on here, but it's so brief I don't really feel like it's super important. We have D, A, F, and B. It's B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is 2, 6, 5. This B is a chord tone, G sharp's a non-chord tone, F sharp's a non-chord tone, E's a non-chord tone, D is a chord tone. That sort of turns into the 7th of this E7 chord, E, G sharp, D, and B. So pretty normative progression here in the key of A minor, 2, 6, 5 to 5, and then we go to 1, A, E, C, and A. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase. It's another section that's comprised of a single phrase that gets repeated a couple of times. It ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. Maybe you're starting to realize why I feel like G might be the overall tonality of this chorale, but I think we start off in the key of E minor with the F sharp going to G here and the D sharp tonicizing E. It really feels like we have a brief stint in E minor, and I feel like this A could be contextualized as our 4 chord in the key of E minor as well. We then move to E, 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 G, and B, tonic triad, passing tone, neighbor tone, neighbor tone. This whole chord here on the offbeat is B7 over F sharp, which would not be 5, 6, 5, it would be 5, 4, 3. Let me go ahead and erase that so it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. And then we get G, E, G, and B, which is 1, 6, E minor over G. This 5, 4, 3 chord's like a sub for 7, 6. We typically see 7, 6 chords in this situation when Bach composes these passing progressions between a 1 chord and a 1, 6 chord, but 5, 4, 3 and 7, 6 are basically the same chord. Another passing tone here we're in the bass, and then we have E, E, G, and B, which is just taking our tonic triad, putting it in root position. I think this is where we move to the key of G as well. This is now our 6th chord, not the key of G. We're moving to the key of C. Lots of harmonic movement in this chorale, so that would make this a 3 chord. Kind of an interesting progression because you might be thinking, Forrest, we have a C sharp here. Why is it that we're moving to the key of C major? And I think all in all, I think what's happening here is we're tonicizing 2, and then we're eventually moving our way towards 1. But this C sharp is really just tonicizing the 2 in the key. But after 3, we get B, D, G, and D. Passing tone in the melody as well, let's not forget that. So we have a 3 to 5, 6 progression. We've seen 3 to 5 with some frequency. It's definitely one of the lesser common predominant chords because 3 and 5 are very similar to one another in terms of pitch content, but all in all, here we see it. And then we get C sharp, C sharp, E, G, and A. This is A7 over C sharp, which is 5, 6, 5 of 2, so we're starting to hint at some transitive progressions here. D minor is typically what goes before G in like a narrative structure where we have a predominant and the dominant going to a tonic, but here we have G going to D, the other way around. And we see transitive harmony all the time in Bach, so even though it goes against the grain, he usually just ends up recontextualizing it as a pivot back towards the dominant, or just approaching the dominant from a different direction. So this A is a chord tone, F is a non-chord tone, E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have D, A, F natural, and A, which is our 2 chords, so it resolves the way we would expect. D is a chord tone, C is a non-chord tone. We then have G, B, F, and G. Bit of a 5-7 chord here, G7 in root position. Then we have some passing tones here. We have C, and we have E, and we could say that there's like a passing 1 chord happening here, but it's so brief, I don't really feel like it's all too significant in the grand scheme of the chorale, harmonically speaking. We have F, A, C, and A. That's an unusual progression, 5 going to 4 in root position. Typically we see 5 go to 4, 6 like we have in this situation right here, but 5 going to 4 in root position is sort of antithetical to the narrative structure that we expect in like a functionally harmonic progression in tonal terms, right? 4 typically goes to 5. It's a predominant going to a dominant that wants to resolve to a tonic, but 5 going to 4 in root position is sort of opposite. It's not even transitive, it's opposite because they are adjacent to one another in the scale. But E is a non-chord tone, it's a passing seventh. B is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, E is a passing seventh, D is a non-chord tone. You could probably read into some type of passing seven chord there, maybe like sort of like a precursor to the seven chord we have here. D, D, F, and B. That's B diminished over D. And then we go to C major in very similar fashion to the second phrase of section 2, where we have this 4-7-1 progression in the key of C, C, G, E, and C. Passing seventh here, but not passing seventh, it's like a passing Lydian fourth in the key of C, but at this point I think we've already moved to G, and this is now our 4 chord. We actually have like the same cadential scheme that we have at the end of this section right here. So 4 goes to 5, D, D, G, and A. G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's a 5 chord. C is a brief passing seventh before we cadence on G. G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. And we are getting ready to move to our second page here. Let me just go ahead and adjust my notes so I can see everything. Yes, very good. So, kind of interesting here at the beginning of the chorale. I think we're still in the key of G major. We have this F natural here at the beginning of the phrase. Maybe there's an argument that we move to the key of C for 2 beats. I don't feel like it's all that necessary. I feel like instead of, we have 4 here, and we have some passing tones here in the, 4-6 because it's over E, E, C, G, and C. With this passing F natural here, it sort of feels like for maybe just a brief moment we are getting some tonicization, like there's an implied 5 of 4 or an implied 7 of 4 going on here in between the 4-6 and what's going on the next page, which is just a root position tonic triad. But I feel like 2 beats, even though the chord isn't fully analyzable because we don't know whether it's going to be a 5 or a 7, we're just going to end up with 4 in root position here anyways, and with the F sharps going in the opposite direction, maybe we're just seeing, G mixolydian just for a little bit. But all in all, we're going to end in a half cadence in the key of D major here, D major, G major. Passing tones here in the same 2 voices. We have D and F sharp, and then we have E, G, G, and C, which is just taking that same 4 chord and inverting it back into first inversion. And then now we have 3 voices moving, and in conjunction with that C right here, we have F sharp, D, and A, which is kind of like a 5-6 chord, D7 over F sharp. And then we go to G major, G, D, G, and B. This A is another 9/8 suspension over the bass. We then get D, D, G, and A. This G right here is a 4-3 suspension. Bach playing with this idea of like scaffolded suspensions that are just offset. He syncopates 1 beat and then it just turns into a series of suspensions that step down. This is a 5 chord D major before I move to G major. G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad. F sharp's a passing tone. We have A, D, E, and A. We know this D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and this is actually a 5 chord, A major in root position. And then we go to D major, 5 of 5, because it feels like we're in the key of D major when we tonicize it, but no, we're still in the key of G, and it sort of feels like the cadence we saw on page 1, which is a half cadence with maybe some imperfect authentic cadence vibes here, but it really does feel like D is being tonicized more than it is being modulated to. 5 of 5 going to 5. D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. And again, sort of in a similar fashion to how we pivot in the context of the first page, I think we get a direct modulation back to the key of C, where instead of getting D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, we have D minor, D, F, right? We have some cross relations here, F sharp versus F natural, where it's now our 2 chord in the key of C with some passing tones in the lower voices, like a passing 1-6 chord or a passing 3 chord. to bridge the gap between 2 and 4, like we saw on the first page. So there's definitely some symmetry going on here between the progressions, if not literal, referential. We have F, A, C, and A. It's our 4 chord. This would be an unusual progression by itself, but with the passing tones that are sort of implying a buffer between the 2 chords, it feels a little bit more sensible, something that we would expect to see, or something that's like conventionally justifiable. But after our 4 chord, F is a chord tone, A is a chord tone, D is a non-chord tone. It turns into like sort of a suspension over the bass here. I feel like this is a 1 chord in first inversion, E, G, C, and G, just because of the nature of the 9/8 suspensions over the bass. But maybe you could call this a 3/7 chord, depending on your relationship with the harmony. To me, this sounds like a C major chord. But afterwards we get D, G. Oh goodness, I forgot to mention that we end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. And this is going to be our gateway back to the key of G, where this is now our 4/6 chord. We've been seeing G pivot, C pivot into the key of G a number of times now, and we're not even halfway done with the chorale. So this D major chord, D, G, C, and A, we sort of have a double suspension going on here, right? Where we have I'm going to call it a D7 chord because the C appears twice and just the D natural. It feels like there's maybe a double suspension going on here, but really I feel like this is like a big 5/7 chord in terms of an idea. D, this G is definitely a suspension. It's a 4/3 suspension. This C, by virtue of the fact that it's being held over in and around the same time as this G, feels kind of like a suspension as well, but it resolves upwards and is really, I feel like the trajectory is more towards the B on the following beat. But all in all, it resolves, goodness, sorry about that, resolves the way we would expect. G, D, B, and B. Tonic triad, G major. Or, actually, I almost tricked myself, not G major. You might be able to spot why this is not exactly a G major chord. We might be tempted to call it 1, but I think it'd be a little bit more appropriate to call this 5 of 4 because of the passing G natural in the bass. Let's see if it resolves to a 4 chord. I think it will. E, C, G, and C. It does resolve to a 4 chord. So this flatted 7th here in the bass, I feel implies a higher function than just it being a tonic. I don't feel like this is G mixolydian. I feel like this is definitely G being repurposed as a tonic in the key of in the key of C. It's the F natural that makes it feel that way. The chord briefly turns into root position as well here, C, E, G, and C, before we go to D, D, G, and A. So this G is like a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We know that's a 5 chord. It's a little late passing 7th as well before we go to G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Moving on to our next phrase, which is the last of the repeated phrase, or not the last of the repeated phrases, but rather the last repeated phrase before our long section that doesn't have a repeat for a great deal of time. This phrase here, probably, it's in contention for the most interesting phrase because I do feel like the overall tonality of this is some type of D minor, but I feel like overall we're sort of in D Dorian territory. We do have the C sharp, so there is some tonal influence where we are trying to, point towards D as our local tonic here, but also with F sharp and this idea of tonicizing G, I don't know what it is about it. We have E minor going on with the F sharp and with the G natural. It feels like D Dorian to me, or sorry, the B naturals. It's the B naturals, the C sharps with the F sharps as well. Maybe it is some like offset melodic minor thing going on, but we never really get melodic minor in one, concise voice. We tonicize D with the C sharp, but the B natural is in the melody, so nothing ever really happens in one voice like we typically expect, like B natural, C sharp, and D in one direction, but we're not seeing that here. So I'm going to put Dorian in parentheses, and hopefully the Roman numerals are clearly articulating that. So we start off with our tonic D minor. We've been seeing this juxtaposition of F sharp and F natural a couple of times in the chorale now. So yeah, namely in the context of moving towards the idea of C. And that also justifies the Dorian nature of this, because although D might be our tonic here, we're looking at D minor through the lens of C major, and that's just a roundabout way of saying D Dorian. So D minor, C sharp, A, E, and A is A major over C sharp. That's 5-6-5. Passing tone here. E is a chord tone actually, so I don't need to mark it. This G is the chordal seventh, and then we have D, E, G, and A. Really interesting chord here because we have the F sharp going on. It's the second F sharp we're going to see in the phrase, but with this double suspension going on here with the G and the E. I reckon what's going on here is that we're getting another 5 of 4 chord. In this case, 5 of G. In this case, because we're in the a minor context, we would expect to see 5 of 4, but with lowercase, because that indicates minor in most cases. In this case, I'm using lowercase based on the premise that I'm looking at it through a minor lens, but you could also use uppercase here if it's less about foreshadowing and more about my analysis. This is a little aside rather, but the lowercase 4 is indicating the fact that after the 4 I would expect after the 5 of 4 I would typically expect a G minor chord, and even if it were a major 4 chord, that wouldn't change the analysis for me, because my analysis is much more about the momentary nature of the chord rather than the what's going to happen after the fact. But yeah, so 5 of 4. This is a secondary deceptive progression though. It kind of feels like G major at this point because we go to E minor. We also have a passing 7th, E, B natural, F sharp, and G. Another 9/8 suspension as well. I feel like this is a 2 chord. If we didn't start off with a D minor chord, I would say we were in the key of G major right now, but all in all, it feels more Dorian-esque to me because the F natural is just going to come back around to sort of reverse what's going on with the F sharps, which I feel are secondary to the F naturals at this time in the chorale. E is a chord tone actually. It's the resolution to the suspension. F sharp's a passing tone, and then we have E, E, G, and B. It's another 2 chord passing tone in the bass here before we get G major, G, D, G, and B with that F natural there. Feels like a 4 chord, sort of this in this idea of D Dorian, the neighbor tone here in the alto before we get C sharp, E, G, and A. It's 5-6-5, A7 over C sharp before we cadence. I'm calling it an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D. This G is a 4/3 suspension here, and then we have the F natural, which brings us full circle back to the D minor idea that we started off with. So definitely an unusual phrase that bridges the this idea of like D Dorian with D melodic minor, because for all intents and purposes they're very similar pitch collections, but here we're seeing them not really contextualized all in the same voice like we would expect. And the the F sharps kind of throw us for a loop as well. Alright, next phrase, we get an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C, but we get there via F major. I feel like this D minor chord could potentially be our gateway to the key of the key of F major. It's now our 6th chord. We then have F, A, C, and A. We also get our first B flat. This is our tonic triad in the key of F. And then B flat is a passing tone, F is a chord tone, E is a little brief neighboring 7th, and then we get F major over A, C, F, and A, 1/6. Passing tone in the bass before we get C, C, F, and G, another suspension here. This is a 4/3 suspension, but we know our 5 is being implied, C major, and that resolves to F, F, C, F, and A. Tonic triad, root position, and with B natural happening here in the melody, along with this passing G in the bass as well. Not as important, but the B natural feels important. I feel like we've modulated to the key of C at this point, and this is now our 4 chord. We have A, C, F, and C, just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. And then we have a passing B natural in the bass. Typically my analysis reflects the modulation happening as late as possible. I tend to think that the modulation is going to happen in the phrase as close to where we see the evidence that the modulation has happened. And here, under normal circumstances, I would be tempted to say the modulation would happen after the 4-6 chord. Like if we saw two C major chords, why would the first C major chord be our modulation point if the next chord we see is the same chord, C major, right? The reason why is because we have these passing B naturals, and if we saw a B natural happen after the first one, even though we get another C major chord after the fact, we have context to justify the modulation, and that's what's happening here, at least in my opinion. But after this passing B natural, we get C, C, F, and G, another 4-3 suspension here over the bass. This is a tonic triad, C major. We have G, C, D, and G. C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This is our 5 chord, G major. And then we cadence on C, C, G, C, and E. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, now we have a large swath of non-repeating material. We go from measure 22 until measure 37. So this would be a long chorale at this point, but we have even more material left. So let's hop into it. This phrase starts in the key of C major and then moves to the key of G major at the end for a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with F, A, C, and F. It's a 4 chord, F major. We then have G, G, C, and D. C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This is a 5 chord, G major. And then we have A, C, C, and F. That's F major over A, which is 4-6. Much more common to see 5 to go to 4-6 than, it's much more common to see 5 go to 4-6 rather than 5 to go to 4 in root position. We have passing tone in the bass, a little suspension prep here in the alto, and an anticipation here in the tenor, which gives us like a passing 5-6-5 chord, G7 over B, B, G, D, and F. And then we have C, G, D, and E, which is our tonic triad in root position. C major, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And I think this could be a point where we modulate, but I think we modulate on the next beat, G, G, D, and, B, G, D, and D. This is our 5 chord in first inversion, 5-6, which in the key of G is 1-6. Just my hunch that we modulate there. Not really super important where you mark the modulation. I feel like it happens here, here, or here, but somewhere before the F sharp. We then have A, D, and E. D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. B is also a little brief neighbor tone. This is A minor in root position, or a 2 chord. We then have D, A, C, and F sharp. It's 5-7, D7 in root position. B is a non-chord tone, A is a chord tone, D is a chord tone. And then we cadence on G major, G, D, B, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase is also pretty interesting. I think we end in a half cadence in the key of D minor, so a bit of distant modulation going on here, because we're going to start in the key of C major and then move to D minor. A lot of playing with the idea of D minor butting up against G major, but here we're going to explore D minor through a C major context again before we move to D minor to close the phrase off. We start off with G, 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 D, and G. Did I read that right? Is that an open fifth? I think it is an open fifth, so some type of 5 chord in root position. Or sorry, no, this isn't a 5 chord. This is a tonic triad in root position. It's still an open fifth though. And this is also our 5 chord in the key of C major. It feels like a 5 chord in C because of the passing F natural as well. And this F natural as well in the tenor. The tenor and the bass are singing in unison here before we get E, C, E, and G. Tonic triad, first inversion. passing D, passing D, passing F, a little bit of an idea of a passing like G7 chord maybe, but not super important because it's not fully contextualized, but it does move to a root position C major chord, C, E, G, and G. Just change the figured bass there, and then E and C are both chord tones, so we don't have to worry about it. Seeing B flat on the next beat, I feel like we're going to modulate here. F, A, C, and A is F major. That's our 4 chord. In the key of D minor, that's our 3 chord. E is a passing tone. F is a chord tone. C is like it's a chordal 7th, but not a chord tone for us right now. F is a chord tone as well. And then we get B flat, D, F, and that same A, which would be B flat major 7. That's a 6-7 chord. 3 going to 6. That's a normative progression, surprisingly, amidst all of the interesting harmony that's going on. E is a non-chord tone. F's a chord tone. D is a chord tone. E is a non-chord tone. Some vocal crossing here between the alto and the tenor. C sharp's tonicizing D here. F is a chord tone. D is a chord tone. I think I mentioned that already. So 6-7 have kind of an interesting chord here. We have B flat, F, D, and G. We would typically expect a 2 chord after this, but what we're actually seeing is 4-6-5. We typically see 2-6-5. It's kind of interesting though to see a 4-6-5 chord here, especially after a 6 chord. I guess one is really operating the same as the other would because they have such similar functions, but C sharp's a non-chord tone, E is a non-chord tone, A is a non-chord tone as well, and this would leave us with an A7 chord over C sharp, which is 5-6-5 in the key of D minor, C sharp, E, A, and G. And then we have D, D, A, and F. That's our tonic triad. D minor, A is a chord tone, D is a chord tone, and then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, and E, with a 4-3 suspension here in the alto. It's our 5 chord. Moving ahead, we have a phrase that ends in the key of C major, perfect authentic cadence, and I think this is just a direct modulation. We have A major right against A minor, right? The cross relations with the C sharp versus the C natural here. So we start off on 6, A minor. We then have B, D, G, and D, which is G major over B, 5-6. And then we go to F major over A, C, and F. It's a 4-6 chord. Again, 5 going to 4-6, much more common. B, G, D, and F. It's like a passing 5-6-5 chord here, G7 over B. We've seen this progression before, 4-6 going to 5, 4-6 going to 5. It's a fairly common progression, subdivided as well. 4-6 going to 5 here. And then we go to C major, C, G, D, and E. Lots of 9/8 suspensions with the tonic triad specifically. Before we go to G, C, and D. Another suspension here. The C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This is a 5 chord. And then we have F, C, A, and F. Another very interesting 5-4 progression in root position. It's like a blues progression. B is a non-chord tone. A little sort of passing 7 chord with that B happening there, but it's so brief it doesn't really feel super consequential. But A and C are both chord tones before we get G, C, and D. C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. That's our 5 chord. A little brief passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on C, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, next phrase, just gonna move over to the 3rd page of my notes here. We end in a half cadence in the key of D minor again. We see a bit of a pattern here. We start off in the key of C major and we modulate to D a little bit in the distance, so we don't need to mark anything here. C, E, C, and G, which is another C major chord. We actually have some passing tones here in the lower voices. I will mark those. Whew, goodness, this is a long chorale, everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with me, and if you've stuck it out this long, thank you so much for supporting the channel. E, G, C, and G. It's like taking our tonic triad, putting it in first inversion. I'm reiterating the Roman numeral because we're on a new page, and if we break a line to a new system or we go to a new page, I'll reiterate the Roman numeral when I'm reanalyzing. Otherwise, I tend to omit it. I'll either just change the figured bass or I'll just leave it out entirely if it's in the same inversion. This is a 1/6 chord, passing tone here in the alto before we have C, C, E, and G. Kind of an interesting thing here. I think what's happening is that we have a 5/4 chord for the same reason that G major was our 5/4 chord in some of those G major phrases. This B flat's hinting at us that there's a higher function here. And we expect this to go to a F chord, which for all intents and purposes it does. It goes to F7, right, or F major 7, F, A, E, and A. But I think something tricky is afoot here. It's actually F, F, D, and A, especially with this C sharp here bringing attention to D minor. I think we have a secondary deceptive progression here where 5, C major, is going to 6 in F major terms, which would be a D minor chord, or in a secondary context, 5/4 going to 2 in terms of C major. So I feel like this 2 chord that's happening here is actually our tonic in the key of D minor as well, and we roundabout see a similar structure that we did, I think, 2 phrases ago. Let me double check. We saw something similar here where we had 6 going to 4/6/5 going to 5/6. Here we're not going to see a 4/6/5 chord, but we're going to see this idea of a 6/7 chord with this similar rhythmic configuration happening on beat 4. We have B flat, F, D, and that same A, which is 6/7. Passing 7th in the bass, don't need to mark it. G's a non-chord tone, A and F are both chord tones, so we don't need to mark those as well. And then we have G, B flat, D, and G. Could make the argument this is a root position 4 chord. I think this D is sort of operating as like a reverse suspension. I swear there's a word for that. I still haven't looked it up. Too busy. But I think this E is actually our operating root. So I feel like this is actually a 2/6/5 chord. E minor 7, no, it wouldn't even be a 2/6/5, it would just be a 2/6 chord. 4 versus 2/6, they're very similar chords. Bach very well could just be playing with the idea of F or E and D being so similar to one another in terms of the impact it has on the harmony. All in all, 6 going to 2 is a much more normative progression, and that's sort of where my ear is going, especially with this motion in the bass. But after our 2 chord, kind of an interesting thing here. We would expect to see 5, but like I mentioned before, this is a half cadence. And it might actually lend itself more towards this being a 4 chord, but what ends up happening is we have 2 going to 1, D, A, E, and F, this E being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and this being a tonic triad. So whether this is a 2/6 chord or a 4 chord, I think really, flip a coin, 6 of one, half dozen of another. They're pretty much functioning the same way. I would expect to see a 2/6 chord in a cadential situation like this, and it feels like this D is resolving upwards, kind of like a suspension, but in reverse. 2 going to 1, kind of a plain progression here that then gets turned around into a half cadence, A, C sharp, and E. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. 1 to 5. Yes, next phrase, we are in the key of C major for the whole thing, ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and I think that this D minor chord that the A resolves to, D, A, D, and F, is our tonic triad, and it also happens to be our 2 chord in the key of C with a passing 7th in the bass. We then have B, G, D, and F. It's 5/6/5, G7 over B, passing tone in the bass, passing tone here in the alto as well, before we get G, G, B, and F. It's another 5thless 7 chord, so I'll just put that in root position. We'll just change the figure bass. We do get the D of the chord on the and, so it is what it is, but it's not happening on the beat, so it's more of a big picture thing happening here if you want to lump it together for the whole chord. And that resolves where we would expect C, G, D, and E, another one of these 9/8 suspensions over the bass. in a tonic context. We then have G major, G, G, C, and D, another 4-3 suspension here following a 9-8 suspension. We've seen this a couple times, more than a handful of times. And then we get A, F, C, and F. Another 5 going to 4-6 progression here. F and A also briefly take the chord and put it in root position before we get G, G, C, and D. It's another 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's our 5 chord. Brief passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on C, C, E, G, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase is a bit interesting because I hear it two ways. It's like a Yanni Laurel situation, if you remember that viral soundbite. We end in a half cadence here in the key of D minor again, some more distant modulation. Lots of looking at D minor through C major or adjacent to C major in this chorale, so it's a lot to unpack and think about based on the different contexts here. We see this B flat here, which sort of puts me in a tough situation in terms of committing to an analysis because I hear it in different ways. So for starters, I think the first way you could analyze it, well actually let's get there first. We go to C, E, C, and G. It's another tonic triad we don't need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get E, G, C, and G. That's just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. And then we have some passing tones here. We have F, we have A, and we have D. It's kind of like a passing D minor chord here. And the reason why this feels significant is because we're proceeding like an E diminished chord over G. We have E, we have G, and we have B flat. To me, this sort of feels like in the same way that we've been seeing 5 of 4, we're seeing another 5 of 4 chord where we're seeing C go into the key of D minor through some type of F major lens. But we resolve to an F chord. And the way that these chords operate, to me it doesn't quite sound like we've modulated to the key of D yet because we haven't tonicized D. We don't get the C sharps until later. So to me, I feel like this is a secondary dominant. I feel like this is 7-6 of 4 because E diminished is the leading tone chord to F, and that's where it resolves. F, C, F, and A. And this D is a non-chord tone. This E is a little passing. Oh, this E is actually a chord tone. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. But yeah, it feels like now this 4 chord is then hinting at D minor. Actually, no, I take that back. After this passing tone here, we have D, D, F, and A. It is our 2 chord, which then feels like D minor. Kind of in a similar metric position that we modulate. No, actually, it happened here. I think all in all, it's a toss-up as to whether or not we're modulating over this A flat, or sorry, this A natural here, or over this F. And it's a toss-up. I really don't think there's one correct answer. We have C natural here, we have C sharp here. Really, it's anyone's guess. It's largely negligible. Bach is in the process of modulating over this point, and with a lot of F and D minor emphasis here, it's anyone's guess. It's not super important, but the process is happening somewhere in this phrase. But then we have D, B flat, E, and G, which is E minor 7 flat 5 over D. That's 2-4-2. We would expect that to resolve to 5-6, which it does. C sharp, A, E, and G, more specifically 5-6-5, 2-4-2 to 5-6-5. The 4-2 chord rather is resolving the way we would expect. And then we have D, A, E, and F. Lots of 9-8 suspensions over the tonic triad. We've been seeing this in the key of G, in the key of C, and in the key of D minor as well. So this is our tonic triad, and then we cadence on A, C sharp, and E, our dominant in the key of D minor. Okay, moving on to the next phrase, another contender for the most interesting phrase in the chorale. I think we have sort of this hearkening back to the first phrase, and if you could remember the first phrase, we had this Aeolian idea here where we didn't have a normative chord progression, and we had some, it was purely notes from the scale, no leading tones, very modal in terms of the sound that it evoked, the resulting sound of the harmony, and we have something very similar going on here. So we start off, I think, we have C sharp versus C natural, very clear juxtaposition of similar triads but unlike qualities. So I think that we are in some sort of A realm, A minor for sure, but I'm going to say A Aeolian to distinguish it from A minor, which we don't have any G sharps throughout this phrase. It's all naturalized tones, which I can't help but make a comparison to the first phrase. So we start off with A minor, which is our tonic. We then have E, G, B, and G. It's our 5 chord minor, a minor dominant. It's kind of interesting when we see minor dominants. D is a passing 7th, A is a non-chord tone, B is a chord tone, D is a non-chord tone, C is a non-chord tone, D is the chordal 7th, but it's not really functioning like a chord tone here before we get C, E, E, and A. It feels like the lower voices are really pushing C major while the melody is really pushing A minor. So there's this interesting juxtaposition of worlds going on here. But we have some passing tones in the inner voices here before we get F, A, C, and A, which is our 6th chord. Passing 7th here in the bass. B is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, D is a non-chord tone, and E is a passing 7th. We then have D, D, F, and A. It's D minor, which is our 4 chord. Again, with the idea of 6 going to 4. That was actually on the last page, but 6 possibly going to 4 here. The more that I think about it, this is probably a 4 chord, and this E is just turning into a suspension, but all in all, they're basically the same chord. It's not a huge deal if one gets on the page or the other gets on the page. I think it just depends on how granular or I guess particular you are about your analysis. But 6 going to 4 here. We then have A minor again, A, C, E, and C. It's our tonic triad. G is a passing 7th, B is a non-chord tone, A actually is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. G is a neighbor tone here before we have F, A, E, and A. We saw a similar chord here, this secondary deceptive progression where this E was like a 7-6 suspension over the bass. And this is actually a 4-6 chord. Before we get some non-chord tones here with the C and the B. F is a chord tone, D is a chord tone, and then we cadence on A minor, A, E, C, and A. It's another plagal cadence, which is why it makes me feel like this phrase is very similar to the first phrase. We end with a plagal cadence in the key of A minor, if we're even in a key at this point, because there's really there's no idea of dominance or functional harmony, so it's hard to use the term key in the most appropriate sense, more like a referential. I actually like that word that I used earlier, referential. But then we come full circle. Is that even really what we're doing in the key of C major at the end of this phrase? I don't know. At the end of the day, it really doesn't make too much of a difference because I feel like there are a ton of different keys that have gotten equal representation, and we moved from the idea of G being the overall tonality to maybe C being the overall tonality to D minor maybe being the overall tonality. It's very difficult to say. Regardless, we end with an imperfect authentic cadence. We start off with A minor, A, C, E, and A. Passing tones in the lower voices, C, E, E, and A. That's just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. I'm going to say this is our pivot point to the key of C. This is now 6-6. And then we have D, D, F, and A. It's kind of like a passing 2 chord a bit. I'll put that there because 6 wants to go to 2. And this is a subdivided progression, but we do go to a 1 chord, E, D, G, and G, maybe possibly a 3-7 chord. We saw a similar harmonic situation earlier on, but I think really this is a 1-6 chord, C major over E, before we go to E, C, F, and A. I feel like we have some double suspension going on here, or maybe even a triple suspension, but this isn't really a suspension. It's more of an accented non-chord tone, E and C. Here we have D, D, F, and B, which would be B diminished over D, that's 7/6, and typically when we see 1/6 going to 7/6, we would expect a 1 chord on the other side, but here we're actually seeing 1/6 again. E, G, G, and C. C major over E. Then we have some passing tones in the lower voices. We have F, we have A, and we have another F, so it's like a passing 4 chord actually, F major in root position. And here, kind of interesting what's going on here with the counterpoint. We have G, B, E, and G. I reckon this could be a, how do I want to analyze this? This could be a 3/6 chord or some type of contrapuntal 1/6/4 chord. What's kind of interesting is that we would expect a 1/6/4 chord, but because we get the C over the F happening at the same time, it's difficult to justify this being a pure 1/6/4 chord. If anything, it's a 3/6 chord, just because it's what happens on the beat, and then after the fact, this F creates sort of a contrapuntal blurring of the chord. But after 3/6, we go to 5, or 1/6/4, however you look at it, G, C, D, and that same G. We have a 4/3 suspension. Equally, we've been seeing 4/3 suspensions over dominant chords, where 9/8 suspensions happen over tonic chords. It's kind of an interesting pattern that occurs because of the nature of the progression. And then we cadence on C, C, G, C, and E. Tonic triad, root position, and we are on the home stretch. We have another repeated phrase here before we have our last section. So this phrase, kind of an interesting phrase here. This might actually be the most interesting phrase in the entire chorale. It's kind of hard to say exactly what key we're in here. I think we start off in the key of C, even though we don't particularly allude to C major at any particular point, but we don't have any accidentals, so it looks like C major to me. The bass feels a lot like C major, but we end in what I'm calling a half cadence in the key of G major. But it definitely sounds like there could be some interpretation for other keys or other ideas from an analytical standpoint. So we start off with A minor, A, C, E, and A, which is our 6th chord, and then we move to D minor, D, D, F, and A. So 6/2, already a good sound, already a good sign. What was I going to say? That's like a normative progression, just because of the fact that 6 we typically expect to go to 2, but instead of going to C major, we go back to A minor, C, A, E, and A. 6/6, which is kind of like a tonic triad, but Bach doubles the A here, so it feels more like A minor than it does C major. Afterwards, we have a passing chord, lots of passing tones, and this leap here in the tenor. F's a non-chord tone. D is an on-chord tone, C is a chord tone, but if we take the aggregate, we have D, F, D, and A, which is sort of like a passing 2 chord again, but it's so brief, I don't really feel like it's super consequential. So it's there, but like I said, it's brief, it's hard to really justify it having a huge impact. But after our 6th chord, we go to 3, E, F, B and G, this F being sort of like a 9/8 suspension over the bass, with this passing tone happening here, which kind of confuses things, but the 3 chord will eventually turn into a 3/6 chord because Bach often changes the bass underneath the suspension, and really this E and this D are decorations. This D is like a little neighboring 7th, and then this turns into a 3/6 chord with just more filigree going on. We have F, which is a passing tone, A, which is a non-chord tone as well, F and, not F, C and D, which are non-chord tones as well, before we go to E minor in root position, E, G, E, and B, which is our 3 chord in root position. So with all the emphasis happening on E minor here, it's kind of interesting because in a major key, the 3 chord is very similar to the tonic triad and gets used sparingly. I'd say 3 is probably the least common chord you'll find in Bach. I can only speak from the context of the chorales, but it really doesn't get a ton of use especially as a chord that gets extended emphasis. So this makes me feel like maybe we're in another mode. I think maybe it's possible that we are maybe not in C major. Maybe there's this idea of E Phrygian going on. I don't know. Personally, to me, when you see when you see a lack of accidentals and then you see a chord progression that doesn't really reflect a new key, maybe there is a mode going on. It would be the first time in this chorale that Bach is alluding to a mode. But all in all, this turnaround at the end here really does spring G major upon us kind of suddenly, because I think E minor is our gateway to the key of G major. It is our sixth chord. We get F sharp immediately afterwards. D is a passing tone as well, before we get C sharp, G, E, and B natural, which is 7, or C sharp minor 7 flat 5 of 5. And with this F sharp in passing, G is a chord tone as well, before we cadence not on D minor, but D major, which makes this feel like the A wants to resolve down to G right here at the end. So really this phrase, I think, is particularly fascinating because Bach uses two, like, I guess, tonal centers that are entirely void of their tonic. You have to use context from within the key and from the chords that are in the progression to discern what key you're in, because you're not going to see a dominant resolve to a tonic in a clear fashion. But yeah, immediately afterwards we have this idea of F sharp versus F natural again. I do think this is just a direct modulation where we are moving to the key of F, and eventually the phrase, I have to get ready with my next page as well, is going to move to the key of D minor. And we sort of end this next phrase in equally a fascinating fashion, but if there's anything to compare this phrase that we're about to analyze with the phrase that we're analyzing here, we have this idea of two similar keys being referenced in conjunction with one another without really alluding to their tonic. But actually I'm going to take that back, because this F major segment that we have here at the beginning of this phrase has clear references to F, so the key centers that are present in both of these phrases are similar to one another. This one just goes into more detail about introducing F and tonicizing F, because we haven't really gotten a lot of F major in this chorale. As far as the keys are concerned, it might be the most underrepresented, maybe tied with A minor. Regardless, we start off with F major, F, C, F, and A. There you go, that's our tonic triad, so we're already starting off with the tonic triad, unlike what we saw in the previous phrase. Passing seventh in the bass before we get D, C, F, and A. I think the C is like a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually B flat over D, which is 4/6. And then we have E, B flat, C, and G, which is 5/6/5, C7 over E, and then we would expect to see a tonic after that, F, A, C, and A. There you go, clearly outlining F major at the beginning here, with another passing tone in the tenor. And then we get, let's see, we have A, F, C, and C, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion, with a couple of passing tones in the alto and the bass. And we finally move on to our last page in the key of F major. Now Bach really does spring the idea of D minor on us right at the last moment, because he's going to go to D minor through C major, and it does create sort of an interesting progression, because 7 going to 5, or I guess more specifically subtonic 7th going to 5, is a progression that we do see from time to time, but it's one of these sort of fast and loose modulations that Bach really just, he gets to a key and sort of stops there. So C major here, C, E, E, and G is our 5 chord in the key of F, and in the key of D minor it's our 7 chord, and then we get a half cadence here in the key of D minor without ever alluding to the tonic, right, because we have this A major cadence, and with B flat and C sharp, it really only feels like there's one possibility for what key we're in, G, B flat, E, and G. I think, maybe this is an E minor 7 flat 5 chord. I think really the C sharp is more interesting here. Or maybe it's the D that's more interesting, but I think it might, yeah. No, I do think that this is a secondary dominant because there is some symmetry between this phrase and the previous one. I think this is actually C sharp fully diminished 7th over G, so that would be 7, 4, 3 of 5. Going to 5. It feels like that C sharp is a lot more important, despite it being... Actually, could this be like an elaborate suspension? Maybe this is 4 in the key of D minor, like a G minor chord in root position. And this wouldn't even be 4-3, it would be 4-2. And the fact that it doesn't resolve the way... Yeah, you know what? I'm going to walk that back. I think this is a 4 chord. I think this is a 4 chord in the key of D minor. And because it really does feel like 4 is going to 5 here. But maybe this is 7-4-2 of 5. The thing that sort of deviated my thought process away from this being 7-4-2 of 5 is the fact that the C sharp really feels like it's enclosing along with the E here, the D, which feels more like the chord tone that leads into the suspension that Bach has been using in his cadential figures so far. But it doesn't resolve the way we would expect. We would expect 4 to resolve to like 7-6, and actually a 5 chord is very similar to a 7-6 chord, so maybe it is resolving the way we would expect, but I think we would sort of expect the F sharp. No, how would that resolve? A 5. Yeah, we would expect it to resolve to it in first inversion, which it doesn't. But yeah, there's possibility there. I do think it's a 4 chord though in root position. And not a Phrygian half cadence because it's approaching it from the bottom rather than from the top, so it's a whole step rather than a half step. And we are closing in on the end of the chorale. We have our last 3 phrases here. We have a half cadence in the key of D minor again, so we have 2 consecutive phrases in D minor. We start off with D, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic, so it resolves. Passing tones in the melody and the tenor before we get D, F, A, and D, another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone and passing 7th in the alto before we get B flat, F, D, and F. That's a 6 chord, B flat major, with a passing 7th in the bass. G is a non-chord tone, A is a passing 7th, and then we have G, B flat, D, and G. I think this is a 4 chord here. We have seen 6 go to 4 in the past, especially in the context of this D minor idea. I think we saw it 2 pages ago or 1 page ago where we saw the 6 go to 4 or the 6 go to 2-6. Depending on the context here, there's an argument for 2-6, but I think with the C and the B flat going on, we actually have a subtonic 7th in second inversion with the G, the C, the E, and the G, C, E, and G, or maybe that would be a 6-4, because we have the B flat going on as well. Maybe 4-3, maybe 6-4. The 7th is definitely part of the chord, but the E and the C don't feel like chord tones to the beat. And then we get D minor in first inversion, so kind of like a modal progression here because we have the subtonic 7th going to the 1. But of course, take it with a grain of salt because it is a subdivided progression. Really, this feels more like 4 going to 1 in the grander scheme of things. F, A, E, and A. Another 9/8 suspension over a tonic functioning chord. Bach loves doing this with D minor chords especially. F is a chord tone, and D is also a chord tone. We then have E, we have B flat, we have D, and we have G. I feel like this B flat and this D, it's possible that this is a 2-7 chord, but I think actually this is a C sharp diminished over E, like a 7-6 chord. So we would expect, 1-6 to go to 7-6 to go to 1, which we actually see here, one of these normative progressions we see in a lot of the chorales, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad in root position. And then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, and E. Tonic triad, root position. And then we have another phrase that ends in a half cadence in the key of D minor. So we close out the chorale with a lot of D minor ideas, proportionate to how much D minor we saw earlier in the chorale. And then we are going to follow that up with some A minor. So we have some full circle going on. Maybe the overall tonality of the chorale is A minor, but we definitely spend the majority of the chorale developing keys related in that are around or in somehow relation to the key of A minor. But we start off with resolving similar to how the previous phrase went, D, A, D, and F, D minor, passing 7th in the bass, B flat, D, and F. A similar progression here. This is a 6 chord, B flat major, passing 7th in the bass, G, B flat, D, and G. I think this is another 4 chord. Maybe there's an argument to be made, maybe there's an argument to be made that this is a 2-6 chord, because this E really does feel like it's moving to 3 here, right? Like we have this idea of 4 or 2-6 going to 3, and when 2 moves to 3, it sort of feels like it's leading tone chord, because 2 is a diminished chord and 3 is a half step above it. It's sort of like 7 going to 1 in the relative major. F, C, F, and A. Whether this is 4 or whether this is 2-6, they're very similar chords in the grand scheme of things. G is a passing tone. A is sort of like taking the chord and putting it in first inversion, but we also have a passing 7th here in the alto, which kind of complicates things. But afterwards we have B flat, D, and G. Maybe this F is our chord tone. I don't really feel like it is. I feel like this is another 4 chord, which just takes us to another 4 chord, more specifically 4-6, B flat, D, and G. That briefly gets turned into root position here with the G and the B flat and the D, with the second G in the melody, and then we get 5. Apologies, not 5. We get 1, D, A, D, and F. Tonic triad, little neighbor tone here, neighboring 7th. Little neighbor tone here, tonicizing A. That's kind of interesting with the G sharp, D, D, and F. Kind of like an idea of like a passing 7 of 5 here, but there's no B in the chord, so I'm not going to bother putting it down on the page, but it's definitely something you could make the argument for in the texture. And then we have a 5 chord, A, C sharp, and E. So we've seen a couple of different variations on the same idea of this D minor progression with slight wrinkles thrown in to make them different from one another, but the melodies are largely conveying the same information, or you can reduce a similar chord progression from the same melodic material. But all in all, I do think we move to the key of C major very briefly here before we end with a half cadence in the key. Maybe I should move it a little bit further over because the cadence happens around here actually. We move to C, and then we move to A, or A minor to wrap things up. So we have B, G, D, and G, which is G major over B, that's 5-6, and that goes to C major, C, G, C, and E, tonic triad, root position. We then have C, E, G, and C again, no need to reanalyze. And we have this really cool chord progression here. It kind of like gets overshadowed by the interesting progressions in the chorale, but we have a D minor 7 over C chord here, C, F, A, and D, which is 2-4-2 in the key of C, and in the key of A, it's 4-4-2. And the really interesting thing here is that it resolves the way we would expect it to. So it's, even though it's happening over like a pedal tone, we have B, F, G sharp, and D, which is, we would expect a 4-4-2 to resolve to 7 in first inversion, and that's what we get. We have 7-6-5, G sharp fully diminished 7th over B, so it resolves the way we would expect. And we have some passing tones here. We have this A and this A, which gives us a bit of a buffer. It's kind of like a 4-6-4 chord, and the reason why this 4-6-4 chord is significant is because it's separating 2 dominant chords, and Bach often does this when 2 dominant chords butt up against one another. He often sort of injects a passing harmony that separates the two dominant or similar functioning chords. Not always, but it's a pretty common occurrence. But here we get G sharp, E, B, and E. We get a long E here, 5, 6. Passing tone here, G sharp, B, D, and E, sort of like taking the chord and adding a 7th, but still keeping it in first inversion. E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. Here we have A, B, C, and that same E, which is our tonic with the 9/8 suspension over the bass. He does 9/8 suspensions over the tonic quite often. Passing tone on the bass. Then there's a change of bass, C, A, C, and E. Passing tone on the bass again. Then we have E, A, C, and E. It's taking our tonic triad. Putting it in second inversion, we would expect a 5 chord after this, E, G sharp, B, and that same E. So we have a 1, 6, 4 going to 5 here. Then we have some little decorative neighbor tones here before we cadence on 5 in the sort of half cadential fashion. And would you believe it, we finished the analysis. Wow, that was a long analysis. Again, it took me 2 days to sort of finish this analysis and really codify everything and rehearse a lot of the reading, because what takes me a really long time because of my reading ability, my dyslexia, is to piece out all of the non-chord tones and to stretch things so that I don't get confused where certain things are. It's hard for me to read and spell on the fly, but once I go through it a couple of times, it's relatively easy for me to record. And what I've been recording over these last several months has been the result of that labor. So all in all, lots of takeaways from this chorale. Possible modality. There are 2-1 progressions potentially in this chorale as well, which is kind of interesting. Some potential mode mixture, this idea of D major being on one side and D minor being on the other side. Mid-phrase modulations all throughout this chorale. Tonal ambiguity. What is the overall tonality of this chorale? I'm going to make the argument and say that it's A minor because we start and end in A minor, and even though we spend the chorale looking at all of the developments and movements away from A minor, the start and the end feel significant from like a thematic standpoint. We have this idea of the tonic just being 5 of 4 rather than the tonic. We've seen this a couple of times in the chorale where it would be an instance of that. Right here, where we see in the key of G major 4, 5, instead of going to 1, we go to 5 of 4, so he just skips the process of going to 1 and then to 5 of 4. Bach does that from time to time. Secondary deceptive progressions as well. Where's the secondary deceptive progression? I feel like it's on page 3, where we have 5 of 4 going to 2. That's the same thing as 5 of 6 in the key that we're modulating to, or sorry, the key that we were talking about in a secondary fashion, so in this case F major. And we have distant modulations as well, where we're going from like C to D minor, or G major to D minor. Actually, do we go from G major to D minor directly? Well, we go from G to like D Dorian, but it's at the end of the phrase. Here we have C going to D within the phrase, so distant modulations regardless. And this chorale is incredibly long. That's another takeaway from this chorale, but that's everything I wanted to talk about. I'm starting to lose my voice. If you're interested in following along on my journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Again, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting my channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.